You're doing a lot of interesting work at the University of Memphis that studies. What are some of the key studies that are going on now with nutritional supplements?
Well, our primary interest area, as I mentioned earlier, is oxidative stress in relation to both exercise and feeding. So we've done a number of studies showing that acute exercise will elicit an increase in oxidative stress. We've shown that acute feeding, whether it be with lipid or carbohydrate or protein, et cetera, will elicit an increase in oxidative stress. And I should stress that
Acute feeding.
so basically, individuals are fed certain meals, test meals, that are comprised of either carbohydrate, protein, lipid, or blended, varieties of these macronutrients. And we measure blood samples usually over the course of a 6-hour period post-feeding, and we can look at the increase in certain molecules that would be indicative of an oxidative stress. And what we do know from our work and the work of others is that lipid, in particular saturated fat, causes the most striking increase in the production of these radical species. Simple carbohydrates like dextrose, for example, may also cause a rise, but not nearly the rise that we see with lipid. So that would suggest to us that it absolutely does matter where the calories are coming from, and certainly a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie, as is suggested by some individuals. That's absolutely not the case. From a metabolic point of view, and from a potential detrimental point of view in terms of development of insulin resistance and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, we do know that it does matter what the macronutrients are, and our work would suggest that high saturated fat feedings could be detrimental to overall health. And that provides some mechanistic link, because we know, I believe, in this day and age that saturated fat is not an ideal nutrient to consume. However, from a mechanistic point of view, it may be due to the fact that high saturated fat within the mitochondria actually allows for or produces an increase in hydrogen peroxide and some of these other potentially harmful molecules that can cause damage and oxidation to other molecules in a downstream sort of fashion.
But what about polyunsaturated fats? They're supposed to oxidize at a certain heat, right?
Right. There's some, again, we're not talking about cooking per se, we're talking about overall ingestion.
Okay.
And there's some evidence suggesting that other forms of fats, for example, there's studies with almonds and different sort of varieties of nuts that show that those actually can provide a health-enhancing benefit as opposed to a detrimental benefit. So I think it's important when we specify individuals should keep their fat intake below a certain amount, we really need to specify what type of fat a person's consuming, because someone may be able to get away with a 30 or 40% fat diet, assuming the fat is the right type of fat. And it's not saturated fat, it's not hydrogenated fat or trans fatty acids, but it's more of the unsaturated variety that may provide some health enhancing benefits.
Is it the chain, long chain triglycerides, medium chain triglycerides?
I
Does that have an effect?
I haven't seen as much evidence in relation to MCT oils and medium chain triglycerides and that sort of thing. Typically the studies involve either a fish oil or a whole food in the form of nuts, as opposed to a saturated fat, which what we use is whipping cream, heavy whipping cream.
And
that's what a lot of other individuals have used as well. Or saturated fat in the form of solid foods such as sausage and eggs and bacon and things like that.
And that's your acute feeding program?
That's the acute feeding protocol. Now, secondary to that, because we know that these things change, our next objective is to determine, well, what do we do about this? Well, the obvious solution is you just don't eat those things. But we need to be realistic. People eat those things. So if people are going to eat with high simple sugar feedings, or they're going to eat with high saturated fat sort of foods, how can we lessen or attenuate this response? That's when we look into some of the nutraceuticals and some of the dietary supplements to see if we feed these along with this sort of meal, can we minimize that response? And one thing that we do know is that the response is strongly predicted by the serum increase in triglycerides. So if we can blunt that triglyceride response, or we can blunt the blood glucose response to feeding, because both of them are associated with the rise in radical species, then we may be able to blunt the overall oxidative stress response. So that's really the target. And there's certain nutrients that we know can provide that sort of benefit.
For
So that's what we're
example,
focusing on now.
any
Well, there's
com-
certain extracts of cinnamon that seem to be
Okay.
pretty helpful. There's a Russian tarragon that seems to be helpful in terms of nutrient, disposal. There's several different antioxidants,
Okay.
of course, that may provide that sort of benefit as well. Acetyl L-carnitine seems to
Okay.
provide some benefit. We're working with a mixed blended antioxidant that we think could be efficacious as well. So there's different nutrients out there. Vinegar, I mean, there's several things that
Okay,
can blunt
vinegar.
the overall response, keep things real simple, and individuals would likely be, healthier as a result. We need, of course, to do those long-term studies to determine that, but from the acute study, if we can make some assumptions based on what we're seeing in the laboratory to if an individual would do this on a regular basis, would they be better off or worse off? We believe that, as we talked about earlier with the smaller, frequent macronutrient balance feedings, that would likely be the best approach.